Let me read to you a passage from the 11th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, verses 11 to 15. It's the Gospel for Thursday of the second week of Advent. St. Matthew writes, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, among those born of women there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing, and forceful men lay hold of it. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. He who has ears, let him hear. That's from Matthew chapter 11, verses 11 to 15. What does it suggest to us? Well, it suggests that Christ is our light. What do I mean? Let me begin this way. You know, there are two cases in the Old Testament in which some form of ascension into heaven is mentioned. The first is the case of Enoch, the father of Methuselah, who, and I quote, walked with God, and he was no longer here, for God took him, we read in Genesis chapter 5, verse 24. The statement that God took him pictures Enoch being taken alive to God's abode. But of course, the question immediately arises as to what this inspired picture really signifies. There are many other sentences in this early part of the book of Genesis which invite such a question, including Enoch's very age of more than 400 years. What does it mean? The other case of an ascension is that of the prophet Elijah. His prophetic career is described over several chapters and concludes in the second book of Kings, chapter 2, with a single sentence describing how he departed the scene of life. We read, he went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Second book of Kings, chapter 2, verse 11. The meaning of this inspired depiction of Elijah's departure is open for reverent discussion. But the final mention of Elijah is in the book of Malachi, which predicts that, and I quote, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. Malachi chapter 3, verse 23. Now, what does the devout believer make of all this? Well, the fact is that there were a variety of interpretations, and this is exactly typical of the story of the interpretation of the Hebrew Scriptures in general. For instance, that it was widely expected that the same Elijah of centuries before would appear again in the flesh is clear from the Gospels. The priests asked John the Baptist if he were Elijah, and it was widely rumored that our Lord was Elijah or one of the ancient prophets come back to life. When our Lord was dying on the cross, the people said, let us see whether Elijah comes to his rescue. Matthew chapter 27, verse 40. The Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, are inspired by God, but the problem always was their interpretation. What was to be made of, for instance, the Messiah himself? Jesus Christ came from heaven to dispel the plethora of interpretations and to bring in his own person the definitive one. The Scriptures in their broad outline are interpreted by the words and person of Jesus Christ. So it is that, for instance, the coming of Elijah too is illuminated by the person and words of Jesus Christ. John the Baptist was Elijah come again. It is he who fulfilled the prophecy and prepared the people for the day of the Lord, which was the coming of Jesus Christ. We read in the Gospel of St. Luke that the angel Gabriel told Zechariah that, and I quote, God himself will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah to prepare for the Lord a people well disposed. Luke chapter 1, verse 17. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, John the Baptist predicts the day of judgment using imagery similar to that of Malachi. He preached that the Messiah was coming and actually identified him. Further, The prophetic ministry, his prophetic ministry that is, was conducted in a style that immediately recalled the image of Elijah to his audience. He wore a coat of animal hair secured with a leather belt. He typically preached in the wilderness areas. As mentioned earlier, the chief priests sent a delegation to ask him if he was Elijah, to which he replied that I am not. John chapter 1 verse 21. In our gospel passage today, our Lord states clearly that if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. Matthew chapter 11 verse 11 to 15. That is to say, the great day of the Lord has begun with the coming of Jesus Christ, and John was its great herald. A greater than he had not been seen. He was a worthy messenger of the predicted kingdom. Among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist, our Lord said. Yet, he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing, and forceful men lay hold of it. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. On the occasion of the Transfiguration, Elijah appeared with Moses conversing with Jesus. And as Jesus and his disciples were coming down from the mountain after it, his disciples asked him about the teaching of the scribes that Elijah must first come. Our Lord replied that yes, but he had already come. They then understood that he was referring to the Baptist. Matthew chapter 17 verse 12. The point I am making is that Jesus Christ is the light beaming across the inspired scriptures, lighting up their meaning, and enabling us to know and love what God has revealed. I am the light of the world, he said. After he rose from the dead, he walked with two of his disciples to Emmaus, explaining the scriptures and interpreting them in the light of his own person, his passion, death, and resurrection. And that very evening he appeared to the 11, reminding them of what he had said while with them, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and Psalms had to be fulfilled. Then he opened their minds to the understanding of the scriptures. Without Jesus Christ, the scriptures will not be properly understood. Let us renew once again our conviction that in every way Jesus Christ is the light of the world.